All right. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for our third speaker series of this year. This event is hosted by the Shoreview Environmental Quality Committee each year to highlight key environmental topics that we feel would be of interest to Shoreview residents. Next month, April 28th, is our last speaker of the year, and we'll have someone from Xcel Energy here to talk about rebates and programs available for energy efficiency and renewable energy projects for your home. Tonight, we are lucky to have two speakers joining us for a presentation on the impacts of winter de-icing products, on our local lakes and their water quality. Matt Koshin is the Lake and Stream Program Manager with the Rice Creek Watershed District. He directs the district's water monitoring program, including for chlorides, and manages water quality improvement projects. Matt enjoys using monitoring data to diagnose problems in lakes and developing projects to address those problems. Matt has a master's degree in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota. John Mansky has 16 years of experience in lake management. He currently manages the Environmental Services Laboratory and the water quality monitoring of 30 lakes for Ramsey County Public Works. He has expertise in chloride management, monitoring, and toxicity. John received his master's degree in biology from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, where he studied chloride toxicity and backwater sediment of the Mississippi River. So welcome to Matt and John, and we'll hold questions to the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paige. I'm going to see if I can't raise this up here. Oh, dropping the microphone, dropping in the hole there. There we go. Then I don't need to hunch over when I'm talking. All right. Thank you, Paige, for that introduction. Appreciate that. Happy to be here tonight talking about chloride and lakes and some of the programs that we do at Rice Creek. And John's going to be talking about some of the things that they do at Ramsey County. So I'm going to jump right into it. Then we'll hand off about halfway through when John will share some of the information that he has from Ramsey County. So what are we going to be talking about tonight? We're going to be talking about what chloride is and what some of the problems are with chloride. I think you're probably getting a hint already with some of the photos where this chloride is coming from. We're talking about where chloride is a problem, both in streams, in the Rice Creek watershed and around Ramsey County, and in lakes. We have a lot of data from both streams and lakes that we can share with you. Then a little bit of information at the end about what can be done about it. All right, so chloride in our lakes and streams, there's multiple sources into our lakes and streams. Road salt is a really big one. It can also come from water softeners. So in greater Minnesota, water softeners or fertilizer, manure, things like that. Those could be more prevalent sources of chloride in greater Minnesota. But in the Twin Cities metro area, it really is all about road salt. So all of that road salt that gets applied out onto our roadways, our streets, our parking lots, of course intended to melt all of the ice out there during the winter season. But all of that chloride runs off when the snow melts. When it rains later in the spring, that runs out. So road salt is the primary source of chloride to all of our surface waters in this area. Typically, then, the chemical is sodium chloride. I think John has a slide where he's going to mention some of the other products that are out there, but that's the main one. Over 300,000 tons of road salt are applied just in the metro area each year, just to give you a sense of the scale of it. And this is actually John's slide. There's a little bit of overlap here, but there's a few more numbers and statistics if you really wanted to dig into the numbers. So just Ramsey County uses 6,000 tons a year to de-ice roads. But it sounded like just in the past couple of years ago, right, 2,600 tons. So usage has been trending down over time. I think another thing important to point out here on this slide is the main users of chloride in Ramsey County. MnDOT, counties, cities, and then of course some commercial application to parking lots and things like that. So, you know, there's a lot of messaging that goes out there about how much salt you might need on your driveway and on your sidewalk and things like that. And certainly that's important, but these numbers don't lie. The bulk of the salt that's applied out there is coming from the municipalities and MnDOT and the counties. That's where it's coming from. So what are some of the problems with chloride? I've got a few slides on this now. Chloride is can be toxic to fish, invertebrates, amphibians. When you're talking about the bottom end of the food chain, like lake invertebrates, this happens to be a Daphnia right here, a little zooplankton that lives in our lakes. This would be I think that's a mayfly down here on the water. Chloride can be toxic to these critters. These are at the base of the food chain, and when you start having toxic effects on things at the base of the food chain, of course, it affects everything else that lives in those systems too. Mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies are typically indicative of really high water quality in our streams, but high chloride concentrations can be toxic to them. High chloride can also be bad for lake plants. So for example, there was a study that looked at sago pondweed. This is a very common plant in our lakes, and found that at higher chloride concentrations, there's reduced germination, reduced dry weight, so it just doesn't grow as well. Now, at really high enough concentrations, there can actually be toxic effects to fish that live in our lakes too. Typically, we're not seeing these in most of our lakes, although some of the really bad ones out there, we might be approaching that. But I think what's important to point out here is that there's a whole host of non-lethal effects that can be observed with fish and other critters. So even if you're not getting to the point where fish are dying, there's many other effects out there like weight loss, egg swelling. I know that John has an extra slide just talking about the osmotic issues. So fish eggs, of course, are just out in the environment, and they can actually swell when they're in higher chloride concentrations. So then there's less survivability there. So there's a whole host of non-lethal effects on the critters and the plants in our lakes and streams. This is a really busy graph right here, and I'm not going to go through all of this here, but just wanted to point out a couple of components of it. So at the top left here, if we're thinking about road salt entering our environment, most of that runs off into our lakes and rivers, at least according to this study. But another subset of that chloride, about 40% of it, infiltrates into the ground. So if you're thinking about the edges of roadways and things like that, salt can actually just get down into the soils on the edges of roadways and percolate down into the soils. That can cause a whole host of issues, flushing of organic matter and nutrients down through soils, so leaving less nutrients in soils, decrease in water retention, flushing of heavy metals. I didn't even know about some of these before I started putting this together. And then there's a whole host of chemical issues that happen at the bottom of lakes and throughout the lakes. But one part of it that I want to draw attention to here is disruption of water mixing. This is a real concern in a lot of our lakes, and we're actually seeing it in some of them. This was the best graphic that I could come up with to try and describe this here. And of course, this is the ocean. But if anybody's ever been like snorkeling or swimming where a freshwater river comes out into the ocean, and you've seen that phenomenon where the water doesn't mix, the salt water and the fresh water doesn't mix, salt water is denser than fresh water. And there's examples in many of our lakes in the metro area where that denser, saltier water is sinking down to the bottom of the lakes and then preventing mixing. But the key issue here is that salty water is denser. So the water with the highest amount of chloride is going to be in the bottom of our lakes, right? So here's another graph to try and describe what I was getting at here. So chloride can inhibit lake mixing. If anybody's ever heard of lake turnover in the spring and in the fall, that happens when lakes have uniform temperature and there's no temperature stratification to prevent mixing. And that's a really important process in lakes for nutrient cycling and other things like that. But when you get really high chloride concentrations, it can actually prevent that spring and fall mixing and kind of lock the lake into two zones. Less chloride and fresher water, higher chloride at the bottom, and it's not mixing. There's actually a term for this now, cultural meromixis. And we could think of this as kind of something that we might have to worry about in the future, or maybe we're not there yet. I actually dug into some of our monitoring data here at Rice Creek and found that, at least on some of our lakes, we might be getting there already. So now this is a really busy graph again, but I think it's really interesting if you understand it. So I'm going to take a minute to go through this graph here. What we're looking at is a profile of a lake. This happens to be Pike Lake, so it's not in Shoreview, but it's in neighboring New Brighton. And we're looking at two different lines here The surface of the lake, think about the surface of the lake as being at the top of this graph, and then the bottom of the lake as being at the bottom of this graph here. And we see as we go down through the water column, the conductivity goes up. Saltier water has higher conductivity, so that salty water is at the bottom of Pike Lake. We also see kind of an inverse relationship with oxygen. So this lake, if it turns over in the spring and the fall, you get oxygen down into the bottom part of the lake. But here in the middle of winter, this happens to be Pike Lake in February 2013. This was the setup. Really salty water at the bottom of the lake, less salty water at the top, and then you have this loss of oxygen as you go down through the water. Now, when, we see this in the winter when we go out to do our winter monitoring, we think, okay, yeah, but in the summer this is going to turn over and we're not going to see this again. But this is actually a graph from June, a couple of years later, but the monitoring is the same year after year. And what we're seeing here is essentially the same condition and essentially the same concentration. Here we have 430 milligrams per liter at the bottom, and in the summer it's still 400. So this lake is not mixing, I don't think, from year to year. We still have the depletion of oxygen, and we still have really high chloride concentrations at the bottom of this lake. So this could be an example of this area where this lake is not mixing anymore like it's supposed to. And that could create a whole host of issues in terms of nutrient cycling and things like that. Some of the other issues with chloride, this chloride then is percolating down through our water table, getting down into our aquifers. I just pulled a couple stats here from the Pollution Control Agency. 75% of Minnesotans rely on groundwater for drinking, but at least 30% of the wells in the Twin Cities area had chloride concentrations that were exceeding water quality standards. So this chloride is a problem for our surface waters, our lakes and streams, but it's also making its way down into groundwater and could be a bigger issue for our drinking water in future years. Of course, I don't need to tell you that road salt causes problems with our vehicles. I think that was my first car there on the top right. Just a statistic from EPA, rad salt, I should say road salt, causes $5 billion in damage to infrastructure. From the Pollution Control Agency, this was an interesting one, approximately $2,000 in damage for every ton of road salt. So it's causing damage to vehicles, but a whole host of other infrastructure as well. I mean, our roadways, bridges, things like that, all of this excess salt causes that damage. Two things on this slide here. One is this statistic here, which I've seen repeated over and over again. It only takes about 1 teaspoon of salt in 5 gallons of water to pollute it. But I've underlined the word forever here because one of the really insidious things or intractable issues with chloride is that once it is dissolved in our waters, there's no practical way to get it out, right? I mean, we can't do reverse osmosis in all of our lakes and streams and things like that. Chloride is non-reactive, and our typical stormwater treatment tools, like stormwater ponds, or if you've heard about rain gardens and things like that, they don't work. They don't remove chloride. We were actually just meeting with business a little while ago in, I think it was New Brighton, and they were saying, well, what if we could just filter all of this salty runoff water through that stormwater pond over there, then it wouldn't be an issue. No, that's not how it works. Once it's in solution like that, it can go into the pond, and the pond is going to be salty. Eventually that pond is going to overflow into a lake, or it's going to move through shallow groundwater into a neighboring area. There's really no practical way to get salt out of our waters. All right, so now we'll start getting into where is chloride a problem. And I'm going to be talking about it kind of generally, and then in our streams. Then I'll hand it off to John to talk about where it's happening or where the issues in some of our lakes. So this is no surprise here, I don't think. This is a map from the Pollution Control Agency showing impairments. There's a state standard for chloride that you shouldn't exceed in lakes and streams. And this map shows exceedances of that. So red and orange are bad, essentially where we're having more chloride. Unsurprisingly, most of the chloride issues are in the Twin Cities area. Now, when we zoom in on the Rice Creek Watershed, if you haven't seen a map of the Rice Creek Watershed, this is it. Shore view is kind of right in this area here. But the Rice Creek Watershed drains a much bigger area than that. Down in the southwest part of our district, that's where it's more developed. The cities of New Brighton, Roseville, Shoreview, Arden Hills. And by more developed, I mean more impervious surface, more roadways, more roads, more parking lots, more sidewalks, and things like that. So this map on the right is kind of a heat map that shows you where there's more impervious surface. That's where we should expect to find more chloride, just because more road salt is applied in those areas. So the Rice Creek Watershed District has a monitoring program. We collect water samples in streams and ditches across our watershed. We do that in all different times of the year, including in the winter when we can, and in the spring when things are starting to thaw out. We can collect these samples and give us some idea of where chloride is a problem. Of course, we look at a whole host of other pollutants in these lakes and streams also. But now when I put this map back up again here, we've got some of these dots, these black dots on the map. These are some monitoring locations in our watershed, and the size of the dot represents the amount of chloride that we're finding. So larger dot equals higher chloride concentrations in those areas. Unsurprisingly, again, as we move from kind of the more rural areas of Hugo and Forest Lake down through Centerville and then into the Roseville, Shoreview area where we have more impervious surface, more roadways, we're seeing higher chloride concentrations. So again, more roadways, higher chloride concentrations. We see that in our monitoring data. Here's some monitoring data from a couple of different sites. So this is at Rice Creek in Fridley. This is Ramsey County Ditch 4 in Roseville, actually not too far from here. And one thing I wanted to point out here is, one, we've got a pretty decent data sets for some of these sites. This is only going through 2020, but we have some newer data as well. But also I've got these boxes on here, green, orange, and red. I mentioned earlier that the state of Minnesota has standards for chloride. So they have a chronic impairment level. That's what's shown in the yellow boxes here. In other words, if critters are exposed to that level of chloride for a long enough period of time, there can be issues. And then an acute level, that's the red. That's where there's a lot of critters out there that if they were exposed to even something in that area for a shorter period of time, it could lead to some real problems. And for many of our sites, we see, easy or many data in the chronic impairment level, but sometimes we're even getting up into that acute level where we could be losing whole invertebrate communities in that system with some of these events here. So this is Rice Creek site again, Rice Creek in Fridley. So this is, if I go back to our map here, just so you can see where this is. Rice Creek empties out into the Mississippi River, just a little bit upstream of the city of Minneapolis. And we have a monitoring site right down here in the city of Fridley that we call, it's the R1 monitoring site, or Rice Creek monitoring site number 1. So it's near the outlet of our watershed. There's a whole lot of water that goes through that site. So most of the time of the year, even in the winter and in the spring, there's a lot of dilution that happens there. So there's a fair amount of chloride that's moving through our watershed, including everything from the city of Shoreview and New Brighton, this whole area. But it's diluted with a whole lot of other water that's coming through there. So, here's some spring concentrations that are well under the chronic standard limit, so we're not too concerned. But two things to pick out on this graph here. From 2008 up through 2023, if you were to draw like a line going through some of this data, you might be seeing a little bit of an increasing trend here. To me, the more concerning issue on this graph is that just in 2023, two of our highest chloride values were not in the winter, not in the spring, but in the summer, in the late summer. If anybody remembers back to 2023, it was a drought year, very dry, very little runoff, very little water in Rice Creek. So what could be happening here? Why would we be seeing high chloride concentrations later in the summer? I think maybe there's two possibilities as to why we're seeing that. One is that chloride could be moving through superficial groundwater. So I mentioned earlier that chloride can percolate down through soils, meet that shallow groundwater table, and then where that shallow groundwater table intersects Rice Creek, we could be seeing that the high chloride concentrations coming out into the creek. Another possibility is that chloride is just moving through the soils, kind of the shallow soils down into Rice Creek. either one of these possibilities is bad. I mean, to see these high chloride concentrations later in the summer suggests that even if we stopped using chloride tomorrow, there's still a whole lot out there in the soils in our shallow groundwater. So that's a real concern. Just a couple more slides here, then I'm gonna hand it off to John. I mentioned chloride impairments. These are the impairments right now in Rice Creek. So these are all of the water bodies in our watershed that don't meet state standards. And unfortunately, it seems like this list is growing every couple of years when the Pollution Control Agency updates this. I'm gonna, well, here now you can see the list. Little Johanna, Long Lake and Ramsey County, Pike, Silver, and Valentine, and one of our county ditch systems, Ramsey County Ditch 4. If I zoom into it, here you can get the sense of it. So Turtle Lake, not yet there. Island Lake, not yet there. But many of the other lakes in this area are impaired. And again, it seems like that list is growing. And we do have some at-risk lakes as well. Lakes where we've been seeing an increasing trend, like Clear Lake in the city of Forest Lake, Centerville Lake in the city of Centerville, Island Lake, Josephine, Spring, and more. These are lakes where we're doing additional monitoring to keep track of the chloride concentrations because there's some worry that that could be increasing. This is where I'm going to hand it off to John Mansky at Ramsey County. He'll be talking about their program there.
Thank you, sir. Hey, folks. I'll talk a little bit about our summer program and some of the things that we do at the county that partner with our chloride monitoring. We have 29 lakes that we sample at our deepest site, and we try and get that in 8 times a year, which is what the MPCA wants to see for deciding if your lake's impaired or not for all the parameters that we test for. We're usually doing a depth profile when we get out there and taking samples to go back for laboratory analysis. Usually about 17 parameters. There are times where we'll do more than that if we have special projects going on, but that's just baseline. So we're looking at as many things as we can to try and see how our management practices on the ground are reflecting in the lake water quality. While we're out there, we're also looking at aquatic vegetation, doing plant surveys, and we do a fair amount of treatment coordination with our partners, and we are a big landowner with our park system, so we do a lot of treatments on beaches and launches to try and prevent spreads of invasive species. With that, we're also doing a lot of monitoring, looking for that, and trying to do early detection with the newest technology that we can find. And we're also looking for harmful algal bloom signs while we're out there to do testing for that as well to see if that's going to be a problem. We're also helping with the DNR to try and find as many ways to get fish for toxicity testing as we can for consumption advisories. In the winter, we switch over to more focused on our lakes that tend to go anoxic. Our impaired lakes will run out of oxygen in the summer, and we'll have fish loss that we stock in there. So on the lakes of list there, or the list of lakes there, Como, Wasso, Island, Otter, Silver, and Beaver. We aerate those lakes with various methods, whether it's a surface aerator or a pump and baffle system where we're moving concentrated oxygenated water into the system to try and give them a refuge during the hard times of the winter. But we're also monitoring the oxygen levels on those lakes to decide when to do that, and also looking at the conductivity measurements to see when we should be monitoring for chloride. History has shown us that right around ice out is when we're seeing our peaks. So we'll measure through the ice, like you can see in this picture. We'll cut a hole and actually sample through the ice. And right around now, right as our ice out is happening, is usually when we're seeing our real peaks, like I said. So we'll be out sampling all of our lakes in the very near future. Here's another zoom in on that map with the MPCA site, as well as a QR code. So you can go to that site if you're interested in looking at what are some really good data summaries for not just chloride, but all the parameters, and really kind of break down what trophic zones your lake falls in and what, if any, the issues are. This is more breakdown data of all the lakes in Ramsey County that we take data from that go all the way back in our history. So some of these graphs are going back to the early 80s when my program started. Red boxed are impaired, yellow are high risk, and you can see that number is. I give talks on this a lot and have a lot in my career, just based on my background in salt. And yeah, every time I'm updating the slide, it's just adding more of these impaired lakes. And it is kind of staggering over the last handful of years how many of those we've seen. The drought conditions tend to give us higher averages. You'll see that in some of the graphs where during high water levels or lots of rain, you'll see an actual dilution effect in the water. That's really the only way we're seeing these come down is just a dilution. and that when you have low water, you tend to see that actually that salt hasn't moved out of the system. You're seeing it concentrate more. So that evaporation and that run out of the lower level concentration, that it leads to a concentration effect. This is, if you average all of those lakes, here's what you'll see on an average basis. So this is all of those lakes averaged. And what you can see is after a really low salt usage year last year, we used almost no salt as a whole metro last year, you actually do see a really drastic drop in the average concentration of all the lakes. So your really shallow lakes will see a more exacerbated effect of this, where they're reacting more strongly. And then maybe like your White Bear Lake is going to stay pretty consistent almost always. But all of those graphs you'll notice had an upward trend that's statistically valid. Here's another look at Lake Johanna, which is one of our most recent lakes that's seen some pretty drastic spikes, even during times where we, like I said, we had really low salt use, and generally all of our other lakes were decreasing in salt, and we saw a really large midsummer increase in chloride. If you look at last year's data, traditionally you will see that as we get more rain, you'll see those numbers go down over time because you're not getting that runoff anymore. That salt's already been washed into the system, and your July rains are just decreasing your concentration. What we saw in Johanna was just consistent and even increasing concentrations over the course of the summer, which makes me feel like we're seeing either, some leaching in, or we're seeing some coming from improper storage on nearby sites. So that's something that I focus on a lot with my employees and with my applicators. We have a full team of people that apply road salt, and so it's my job to make sure that they're being as smart and as savvy as they can about it, because it's expensive, it's a known toxin, and tracking it and trying to have goals set for decreasing concentration is one of our main priorities in this realm at the county. So all of our applicators go through the NPCA smalt salting training. We use brine salt whenever conditions allow, and are really following the guidance of MnDOT on when we should be using what chemicals, and when we should be plowing and when we should be applying. I try and do as much education and outreach on the subject as I can. And really the take-home message is just trying to get that ice buildup off before you add chemicals. We invest a lot of money into tungsten carbide blades that we apply to all of our trucks that allow us to do just that, just scrape up more, so we have to apply less, and then educating our employees on how that works, so that they're knowing to use more power and less chemical. Is just another breakdown of what we've seen as far as total snowfall and total salt use. And you can see those peaks kind of track each other until these last handful of years, where we've really battened down on excessive use, been really smart about tracking our usage, and then educating our employees that are the heaviest users, and trying to reward the people who are staying within the required amounts that they're supposed to be using, and finding ways to incentivize good practices and trying to change the culture has led to what you'll see is just a less usage even during times of high snow. Here's kind of a breakdown of all the other chemicals that are on the list of good practices, if you could. And you'll notice a lot of them have potential side effects, and they all, the chloride-based deicers, all, whether it's calcium, magnesium, or sodium, all have the same principle. They're using ions to change the melting point of ice, and whenever you do that, those also then mess with organisms. We talked a little bit about osmotic stress earlier. A good metaphor I always say is, like, think about how much salt intake can affect just a human body, and how if we're off on our salt intake at all, you will have really bad cramping, and it's actually our LD50 of salt is actually a really low number as well. If I go forward a little bit, I'll show you like a better, this is gonna be all at the end. So this kind of shows what you normally see with when you have ions outside of a cell and less inside. They'll force in by passive diffusion, and organisms can have mechanisms to try and pump that stuff back out, the ions, or to try and prevent it, but that process is taxing and stressful in itself. So while the organism can stay alive through the process of having a very salty or chloride-rich environment, they can't for long, and then they can't focus on normal things like eating, reproducing, the things that we need them to do to keep the food web balanced. So yeah, basically all these things, including like carbohydrate, beet juice, and all those things, all have their pitfalls. And there's a time and a place for all of them, I guess, and finding the right mix for your diet, I guess, and trying to keep your lakes low salt is something we're constantly tweaking, and looking forward to what the new wave comes from that regard. But because we know that all those things aren't great, you have to be smart about your infrastructure. And so this is something I stole from Connie Fortin and Bolton and Mink and their low salt future design plan, where you're being smart about your roadways. You can see in this roadway, all the snow will continually flow down the elevation. As you can see, the slope goes down or up the picture, and that snow will continually melt every time the sun shines on it, and it will go across the road and it will melt, or it will freeze again, and you'll have to apply salt again. And by merely putting in a drainage system there or making a small ditch, you could avoid that and not have to have all that maintenance. And doing that in the beginning of our road plans is now something we're really smart about. Trying to make sure that you get as much sunlight on the road as you can during winter months is another thing that we're smart about, and trying to keep trees at a certain set distance away from the right of way so that we can have all those infrastructure things in there. As far as citizens go, I think the best thing you can do is if you see a company or an applicator, whether it's a city or a county, and they're being egregious, if they have large concentrations or piles outside of their business, or you see that on roads that are managed by a certain entity, you as a citizen have way more sway than I do, or a lot of us professionals do. A simple call saying, hey, it seems like you're using too much, or simply telling that to an employee when you walk into a store can have real effects and real change, can cause real change, much more so than like me asking them to do it for the 12th time. You'd be really surprised how much, when I take that approach as just a customer, I get better feedback than when I come to someone as a professional trying to give this type of talk. We really like the brine application, and I think some people kind of misunderstand how and when it's most effective. This is a great example of you would never want to put it on the actual material. When it's really best at is when it's allowed to get on the road, dry, pre-event, and then have 100% contact. We have a lot of problems is the rock salt sheets off when you're applying it, and can be mechanically removed when you plow, and it just never really even has a chance to be on the roadway. So it's just one more way to have you have 100% of it doing the most work you can to try and limit your usage. Another great thing, if you're interested in trying to help find sources of high salt runoff, is the Walton League has a great salt watch program where you can get a kit, and it has all the sampling material you need, and a self-addressed envelope to send to a lab where you can grab water from your neighborhood and see how salty it is. And then all those results are tracked on their page that show all these citizen scientists collaborating on, trying to find sources in their own backyard that maybe me or Matt aren't testing. And then we can see that data, and we know hey, we should go look at that general area and find out which business owners potentially are storing on site, and try and make sure that their business practices of storing and handling that salt is as smart as it can be. Here you can see just some prime examples from Matt's office of what happens when you use too much salt. You can see his cement building is pretty eroded at the baseline there, and you see some pretty large piles. So an example where they were able to talk to their applicator and just say, hey, that was probably a little more than we'd want, or those practices aren't great. And if you have a spill like that, you should definitely sweep up and reuse that material. With that, thank you so much for having us, and we would love to answer your questions. Yeah.
So talking about
Sorry,
putting,
you have to speak in here so the people online can hear.
talking about
It won't,
talking about putting brine. Is it on?
I think it's on. It's just for the people
Okay.
online so they can
Oh, okay. It seems to me you should be able to siphon that salty water out of the bottom of lakes and reuse it instead of taking fresh brine with additional salt.
That's not one I've heard before. That is, I am not. I love that idea. Generally speaking, when we're thinking of the concentrations of salt in the brine that we're using, it is much higher than our bottom of the lake, salty lake concentration stuff. But I could see that as a management practice that you could potentially use. We aren't generally ever trying to steal lake water for many management practices, and that we're always having water level issues. Most people want more water into their lakes in the Twin Cities metro area, but that is not an idea devoid of merit.
Yeah, I think I had a slide. Let me see. I think this is on. I had a slide earlier that said there's really no way to get, no practical way, I think is what I underlined on the slide, to get chloride out of our waters. So pumping salty water out of the bottom of the lake, it's something that could be done. I think the key word is practical. What would the costs of that be? And for all of the lakes out there right now that are experiencing these high chloride concentrations, the cost of that, I think, would just be really, really high.
It's just looking at the cost of doing that versus, I mean, you have to factor in the cost of having salty lakes.
Sure.
So
Yeah, it's a good point.
that's a big deal.
Just a quick question. I noticed 2 years ago when we had the 90 inches of snow, you used half the ice or salt than you did the other years. When we had 70 inches of snow, you used less than half the salt. What's your record on car accidents during the year you used half as much salt as the previous winter with 70 inches of snow?
Sure. I will say that I'm never winning the argument of less salt over safety. That is something that everybody in the metro universally agrees that safety is imperative, and plenty of communities have demonstrated that they can have still safe, good driving records with using less. There's a ton of communities in Canada that don't use it at all, and the real goal is eventually people understand and change their expectations. But we're not at that point in the Twin Cities Metro. People want clean lane miles as soon as possible, and that's what my maintenance staff is generally shooting for. And they're just trying to know how much salt we can use over the course of the year for our goal and trying to be smart about it. So it's about tweaking when you apply. Sometimes you have really large snow events and you only have that salt once, so those numbers aren't all the same. What we're really looking at is how much you use per snow event, and that's the real number that I harp on with those guys is let's make sure that we're never having a crazy heavy one, so to speak. Let's keep it within the scope of what MnDOT tells you is effective, because you can go over that pretty easily, and that's when you just get pure waste. So we're just trying to avoid those.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very excellent. So actually, I have a chance to work in a regional level on regional chloride pollutions. So this is why I always pay attention to chloride. So I've been in Minnesota, Shoreview, more than 10 years. I say 10 years ago, you use a truck split salt particle. It's very terrible, but now I say you use iced water. I can say it reduced a lot. The reason I say this because if you take a look at the best council's result, you will say in the region, and the major river and the 90% of a stream have a chloride increased, and for the last 10 or 20 years. And in terms of water quality in the region, because government spent a lot of money investment, water quality improved significantly, but only 1 parameter chloride increase in the region, including groundwater. So in terms of chloride in Rice Creek, you see the concentration show, and with the dot monitoring. So because this actually is a chloride change over time, especially in the season, you will see in the winter with high concentration, spring when the snow melt, more water will concentration go down. Normally, you have a high concentration in the summer, but normally some should be lower. The reason I mention this because you can use actually a technology, statistical analysis developed by USGS called QW-Trend. This actually remove the impact of seasonal and flow change. You will see your concentration flat, smooth. You clearly show your concentration in the rice grains go up, go down. This technology is easily available if you like, just kind of information.
It's a good suggestion. We haven't done trend analysis with our chloride data yet. The seasonality effect, I mean, in lakes, it's maybe No, I suppose it could be used for lakes as well. But for our stream data, it goes up, it goes down. The data can be very noisy, so you're right, using a program like that, yeah, technology like that could help us smooth it out. But I think whether it's the lakes or any of our stream systems, if you look over a long enough time frame, there's a pretty clear increase in pretty much every system that we look at, which I think you mentioned.
So in Tromsø, Norway, they heat their streets. They use geothermal heating. And I liked your slide about smarter building of our roads and whatever. And I would think that, maybe doing the whole thing would be expensive, but at least bridges and very busy areas that would be helpful.
Yeah, very much so. I believe the new 35W bill had some of that integrated, and yeah, anywhere where you can afford it, it's brilliant, because those are the worst zones. Every bit you put on there is definitely going in the water when it rottens off. There's no chance that any of that stays or goes anywhere else. So yeah, we're always trying to be smart with that, and yeah, they get the iciest.
It's probably going to take a mix of technologies and ideas to reduce our dependence on chloride for safety, whether it's heating roads or maybe going back to some grit material in some places. In some regions of the country or on other countries, they put on winter tires and use studded tires and just put up with some of the snow and ice. Yeah, it's probably going to take a mix of different ideas and technologies to wean us off of road salt.
There are some places I know, like City of Woodbury has installed some heated sidewalks in front of their library and City Hall. Yeah, there's a product called heated paved drains. Like Shoreview has the paved drain road, like Owasso Boulevard. So they now make a product that's heated, so it does exactly what you're saying. But yeah, it's finding that cost threshold. Any other questions? All right. Thank you to our speakers. Thanks for being here. And thank you all for coming tonight.